has there ever been a habit that you have struggled to break or struggled to implement? Weight loss, reading before bed, getting enough sleep. I know I've struggled with all of those things and have only recently tried to dial in and be more intentional about the things that I want to be in charge of my life. So eating right, going to the gym, reading more, journaling, etc. Those things have helped myself personally, my love life with my wife, and just, being a better husband because I'm more attentive. I'm not stressed from lack of sleep, and then running my business, running this podcast. So one of the ways that's helped me has been reading this book called Atomic Habits by a guy I've looked up to for multiple years, James Clear. And he's a Renaissance man. He talks about everything on his site. He has one of the most popular newsletters in the world, one of the few that I subscribe to. And I took a chance that he might come on the podcast to talk about habits with us and talk about how can we start things that are going to make our lives better. How can we live better every day? And so James is, I would say, the expert and the most recent curator of this research. And I just wanted to pick his brain a little bit and dive into that. So without any further ado, here's James Clear. James, how's it going, man?
Hey, doing well. How are you?
Good. It's you're in Singapore right now, 12 hours ahead. So thank you for making this happen, man.
Yeah, of course. Good to talk to you.
So I was thinking of this the other day, and I don't want to waste too much time, but we'll waste a little bit of it. And I was thinking if you were a superhero, you could just be called Mr. Clear, and that would be really cool.
Yeah, it's not bad. And there's already Mr. Clean, so I don't know. Maybe we'll do that for combo.
Oh no. And both you guys, I don't know what you look like now, but in all your headshots, and I've seen you on videos, you don't have any hair, and I'm like, oh,
I know, right? Yeah, so we'd be like quite the tandem.
Wow, that's your nemesis right there. So for the folks that don't know you, we did an intro before. Who are you? I've known you since I found out about you through your strength training blog set and mostly intermittent fasting a few years back. And then another entrepreneur I know, Sean West, is a big fan of yours and found you through that way. But now you have a book, and so I've read that, and that's incredible. So what are you telling people now when they ask who James Clear is?
Well, the simple way to describe it is that I write about how to build good habits and break bad ones. And that's the topic of the book, Atomic Habits, and has been kind of at the center of my work for a few years now. So I've been writing articles, weekly articles at jamesclear.com since late 2012. And so the first 3 years, I just kind of fashioned that writing habit. And I explored a lot of different topics. Like you mentioned, intermittent fasting and strength training. Sometimes I wrote about medicine and health. Other times I wrote about productivity or strategies for being more effective. I've written about creativity and kind of the creative process. And then I also wrote about habits and behavior change. And my thoughts on habits and human behavior and what motivates us and what shapes our actions and our ability to stick to routines have they kind of stuck a little bit more than the other ones. And so I started to double down on that and focus on those topics a little more, and eventually developed enough of, kind of a collection of ideas that I was able to form the backbone of a book, and then get a book deal with Penguin Random House. And then I've spent the last 2 or 3 years writing and researching and kind of refining all of my thoughts on that before finally producing Atomic Habits.
I love that. So before book deal, did you feel more of like a curator and maybe experimenter of these particular kind of facets of what you're focusing on? Again, you've covered everything from strength training, like you said, to psychology, to sleep habits, etc. And then now, once you get that book deal, it's more of a, all right, let's get some, and you're already a very, very good writer as far as getting sources and stuff like that for your research. Did the book deal kind of level that up for you, or were you always just diving in?
Well, I think, broadly speaking, all of my topics or articles kind of fit under the heading of how can we live better? So I just personally am interested in that question. I think a lot of other people are as well. And so I kind of always had that kind of central thread running through my work. But I do think that the process of writing the book has upgraded the quality or depth of my thinking and the work that I've done. So I like to have both scientifically grounded ideas and research backed ideas that I write about, while also being like a practitioner of that stuff. So a lot of the topics that, you just mentioned there, like strength training, I have a background, a career as an athlete. So I played baseball all the way through college and a variety of other sports growing up. So that kind of gives me a chance to implement some of the ideas that I write about. So I have my sports background. Now I compete in weightlifting and things like that. As a creative, I have obviously the writing that I do, but I've also done travel photography in over 30 countries now. And so those that's a chance for me to test out some of the ideas that I write about, like the creative process. And then, of course, running my own business for the last 8 years now, I've had a lot of chance to kind of optimize my productivity and efficiency and think about thinking strategically. Decision making is another topic that I write about. So I guess my point is that they do kind of, all the topics kind of broadly fit under how can we live better. But I also like topics that not only are scientifically backed, but are ones that I can like try to implement myself, because my kind of central strategy as a writer is I want the ideas to be practical. I want people to be able to use them. And I think a lot of great theories fall down when it comes to the implementation. And so my readers and I are peers. We're going through it together. We're like experimenting and testing these ideas. And the only difference is when I test something out, I just happen to write about it and share it too. And I think it's important to know what it feels like to struggle on a daily basis to implement some of that stuff, because things can sound sexy or attractive when you read about them, but it's rarely like that in daily life. And so I hope to have a little bit of that like element of grit and perseverance and the daily difficulty of implementing the ideas kind of come through in my writing as well.
I love that. It makes so much sense too, because I feel like, maybe 10 years ago, prior to social media, podcasts, other resources, video, the people that you would look up to for changing your business, changing your habits, changing your, the mastering your life kind of crowd was this unapproachable guy in a suit. And even if their stories were authentic, it definitely never felt like you were in it with them, and it never felt like you were part of a team and trying to, they never told you their failures necessarily. And so I love that you're kind of trying to align with the people that you're reaching as well. Have you, we both know this as people who own our own businesses, but what was the point of just habits specifically, or was it you found that they were tied into everything? So if you had better sleep and you were more productive in the gym, then the non-body-esque things were more productive as well. You're more productive in meetings, more productive in, your family life in Ohio, et cetera. Like, what was that kind of breakthrough for you of habits and better life? Kind of intersecting all that.
I think that habits are kind of one of two central pillars, I think, for living a great life. Like they're very important, but they're not everything. But the two things that I would say that like pair nicely together are decision making or strategy and habits. And so the way that I describe it is your decisions sort of set the trajectory or the potential available to you, whereas your habits determine how much of that potential you realize. So, for example, imagine you have two entrepreneurs and one of them decides to start a business and they're going to start like a local pizza parlor. And the other one decides to start a software company. Now, that initial decision is actually very important, because if you were kind of draw like a dotted line out into the future of what they could potentially achieve or how big that business could potentially become, the software company probably has the higher growth curve.
Yeah.
But but that's only part of the story, right? That initial decision is only the first part. The second part is your habits. And so you could be an entrepreneur who starts a local pizza shop. And if you have really killer habits and great execution, you could end up with a much more successful business than someone who just has a good idea for a software company, but can't execute on a daily basis. And so, of course, ultimately, what we're looking to do is to have both great decisions and great strategy and great habits. And once I started to realize that, I just began writing about both those topics. As I said, I've written about decision making and strategy as well. But for whatever reason, maybe it was the place that I was at in my life at the time, or just I had more ideas on habits in the moment, I focused more on that part. And the more that I wrote about it, the more feedback I got, and the more people seemed to be interested and excited about the ideas. And so that was where I went. And now that I've written what I hope is the most comprehensive book on habits, I am now thinking more about, okay, let's try to master that decision making and strategy piece too, so that we can have like both of those in tandem with each other.
No, totally. Let's do atomic decision making part 2. Let's go. I love that. Now, before we get into it, I want to know, throughout all your research, writing, etc. And now you've done like a bazillion podcast interviews, and I'm sure, and I even saw you on like Good Morning America as well. So it was insane. Is there a habit that you see that all of us struggle with, or only Americans struggle with? And then kind of diving even deeper, what was one that has just been really tough for you to implement?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know about one that only Americans struggle with, but I do think one that is like fairly universal is the habit of looking at our phone too much. And it's a really hard one because phones are really powerful. You know, they're these little computers in your pockets, and they do all kinds of great things for us. And but I think most of us, maybe many of us, feel that we kind of have this like underlying tinge where we're feeling like, man, I'm checking this just more than I would like. You know, I'm looking at this maybe a little too much. And so one thing that I've started to do to rectify that a little bit is, doesn't work for every job, but if you can do it, I leave my phone in another room until lunch each day. And that one little habit of like walking to a different room and setting the phone down in the morning, man, it really carves out a lot of productive time for me where I can spend my time kind of working on my own agenda for the first few hours a day and not responding to everybody else's agenda. And the funny thing to me is that if I have my phone next to me on my desk, I'm like everybody else, you know, like I'll look at it like every 3 minutes. But if I have it in another room, like I have a home office, so it's only, 45 seconds away. It's like, just downstairs in a different room. And I never go get it. And so I'm like, well, did I want it or not? Like on the one hand, I wanted it enough to check it every 3 minutes when it was next to me. But on the other hand, I never wanted it bad enough to work 45 seconds to go get it and walk down the steps. And I think that kind of like showcases how modern technology has shaped or changed our habits in a lot of ways. Like there's so many behaviors now that are so frictionless, so convenient, so easy that we slide into them just when we have like the slightest whim of a desire. And in a lot of ways that's good, but in other ways it doesn't serve us that well. Like some other examples, for 99.99999% of human history, if you wanted to get calories, if you wanted to eat food, you had to expend calories to get calories. You had to, like, at a minimum, forage in like a berry bush or, kill something to eat it. But now you don't have to expend any calories to get calories. You could just tap Uber Eats on your phone and have it delivered right to your door. You don't even need to like get into the car to drive through the drive-thru anymore. And so that level of convenience, that level of ease, humans are wired to seek the path of least resistance. And it's a good reason we're that way. Like it saves us a lot of energy most of the time. But there are some examples like that where modern technology is kind of like the incentives are a little bit misaligned now. We're seeking the path of least resistance, but it's not serving us as well as it had in the past. And then, another one is like Netflix, right? Like Netflix and YouTube are interesting because if you're going to read a book, for example, you only get to continue reading the book if you continue like reading lines and flipping pages. So you have to put work in to continue to progress. But once you've pressed play on Netflix or YouTube, you don't have to put any work in. All you have to do is keep your eyes open. So it's actually more work to get out of it than to get into it, right? Like once you've started, it just continues automatically. And so a lot of new technologies are like that, where it's easier to continue the habit that we're doing than to stop and perform the habits maybe that serve us best. So I would say that kind of broad creep of technology is probably something that a lot of us deal with when it comes to our habits. The other question you asked was one that I've struggled with specifically. And of course, like I'm challenged with the technology piece just like everybody else. But another one that had been hard for me for a while, I'm starting to get a little bit better at it. I've talked about this on other podcasts, and so because I keep getting asked about it, I'm like focusing on trying to get better at it, so I don't have to keep talking about this weakness. But I sleep fine, but I don't have a great power down routine. Like I tend to I get like a second wind around like 9 or 10 p.m. And then I'm like, well, maybe I'll just do an hour of work, and then you turn around and it's like midnight or 1, and I have this little personal rule where I don't cheat myself on sleep. So I'm going to get at least 8 hours. But, if I go to bed at 1, that means I'm not getting up till 9. And I would prefer to be up earlier and get the day off to a more productive start. So there's the power down routine has been one that I've kind of struggled with over time.
That's fascinating. I know a few people that, I referenced Sean West and a few other folks who have this very elaborate power down. It's timed at 8:30. The lights change color. Like all the lights in the rest of the house go down, but the ones in the bedroom are inviting, and they change color to be more of a warm, like getting ready for bed. And then like the phone automatically goes in do not disturb, and it's pretty fascinating. But it's one of those things too. And I wanted to get to the next thing based on what you said, which was chaining the habit together. Like if you want to wake up early, well, you have to go to bed early. Like it starts the night before.
Right.
Before I get into that, I did realize that what you're mentioning about the technology draw, it almost sounds like these apps and companies and the phones for the relationship between technology and humanity, we're talking really big stuff now, is almost like everybody looked at, like you and I both know for SEO on our sites, the bounce time thing that we're tracking. That's how it feels is, once they got there, we want you to stay, to almost like we want the default to be there. And, I imagine if phone makers could do it to where our phones were in our hands 24/7. Even for me, you're listening to a podcast or doing something on your phone and you almost are sad that you have to get into the shower, if you're addicted to your phone, or you're sad that you have to put your phone down. And that's like the one stat that I feel like they looked at and they're like, what if people just never had to leave? And that's so fascinating about the difference between reading a book, which we have to put in even a microscopic amount of effort to keep going, if you will. Whereas both of those are kind of left, YouTube and Netflix are good examples of kind of default. And hey, we can be there as long as you need us to be there. Whereas the book is like, no, I'm there as long as you need me.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. It's hard. I don't think that, sometimes this will come up and people talk about technology companies or, I don't know, trying to like ruin our attention or whatever. I don't know that it's particularly vindictive in any way, but it is like an unintended or an unsatisfying consequence of the way that the incentives are lined up. Like, I mean, capitalism rewards people who build products that get used and are valued highly. And so there's just a natural drive for any company to create a product that is engaging and useful. And for each individual who works at that company, they're just trying to do a good job. And a good job is often measured by things like you mentioned, like engagement or time on screen or time engaging with the app or the number of likes and clicks and all that type of stuff. So it's kind of like this collective ball of momentum that moves everybody toward a more engaging product. And we want more engaging products because that leads to more successful businesses and a more desirable or more enjoyable consumer experience and so on. And I don't know, it's just like it's a hard challenge because it's like, well, do you want a more pleasurable product? Yeah, of course you do. It's like everybody wants things that they enjoy more, but the better that these apps get and the better that these products get, the more enjoyable they are, the harder they become to turn off. And so at some point, there's kind of like a conflict there between, well, I wanted it to be enjoyable, but I don't know that I wanted to spend all my time on it.
Right, 100%. I mean, even you and I both being photographers, our cameras do one thing, and we press a button, it does one thing versus our phones, year over year, they do a lot more things, and it's so useful, right? And it keeps our time, and you can track your weight, you can do these things, you can set an alarm, you can video time your friends, you can record a podcast. Whereas I feel like 500 years ago, somebody made you a sword and you're like, oh, I'm not going to go to bed with my sword. I'm not going to wake up with my sword. And it's the idea of having a device that does everything. When we were talking about kind of fitness and going to bed even, and have you done, I've heard this, I feel like other places, but obviously because of the habits I want to see, have you found relation to like putting those habits together? Like we talked about, having that power down routine, so that you can go to bed, so that you can get 8 hours, so that you can wake up, or like putting out your clothes the night before. What has been your kind of research around that for people who are like, how do I just start like the smallest thing I can possibly do?
Yeah. It's a good question. So I guess there are a couple different ways to answer this. So one is that There's a strategy I talk about in the book that I refer to as habit stacking. I first learned about it from this Stanford professor named BJ Fogg. He kind of refers to it as anchoring, because you basically what you do is you anchor a new habit to an old one, or in my language, you stack the new habit on top of the old habit. So, for example, let's say that you wanted to start meditating, and every morning you already make a cup of coffee. So you could say, after I make my cup of coffee, I will meditate for 60 seconds. And so that's your little habit stack there. And so one answer to your question is you can create little habit stacks at different, like, appropriate times throughout your day. So maybe you have one little stack that's at the beginning of your day, like, after I make my cup of coffee, I will meditate for 60 seconds. After I meditate for 60 seconds, I will write my to-do list for the day. After I write my to-do list for the day, I will select the most important item and begin working on it immediately. And so that's just like a little, sequence that you can follow that kind of gets your day off to the right start. But then you may find that there are like other entry points throughout the day that are also useful for different stacks. So like maybe you want to start reading more, get in the habit of reading a book every night. So you could say, well, in the morning, after I make my bed, I will place a book on the pillow. After I place my book on the pillow, I will go to the bathroom and brush my teeth and take a shower and whatever. And that little action of putting the book on the pillow, that's like a way to use habit stacking to kind of prime your environment so that when you climb in bed later that night, you'll have a book waiting for you and you can read a page and then go to sleep. And so habit stacks can be useful like that. They kind of create like a set of rules for you to follow where now you know exactly, explicitly, when and where this new habit's going to live. And I think that kind of specificity is important for building habits because although it sounds simple, the truth is most people wake up without that stuff figured out each day. They kind of have this like general sense that they want to change. It's like, well, I'll just start eating healthier, or to this time it's going to be different. I'm going to stick to exercising, or maybe if I really wanted it, then I would do it. And like those things are fine. It's fine to have those goals and ambitions, but they tend to be fairly vague. Whereas habit stacking makes it very explicit. And that specificity helps you realize the moment when you should be acting and increases the odds that you're actually going to follow through.
Right. It's the difference between being reactionary and kind of like we talked about before with the Netflix thing, just having your default morning routine versus intentionality, and like, I think most people waking up, if they don't have a plan, they're like, well, the time between now and when I eventually have to quote unquote get to work is X amount of time. Well, I'm going to casually do the things that my body wants me to do, or that I think I can remember. Like I think I was supposed to put out the lunch for the kids, or I think I was supposed to do the laundry, or I think I was supposed to brush my teeth. And some of those are more natural. And it's one of the things after reading the book, it's like everyone has habits in general. It's the idea of like we should change different ones or implement new ones and pull away old ones.
Yeah, if you don't have a plan, then often you end up just acting based on how you feel in the moment. And sometimes that's fine. But if you want to be consistent about something, then your feelings fluctuate, motivation fluctuates. And so if you leave it up to motivation, then a habit by definition is something that is reliable and stable. And motivation and feelings are something that fluctuate over time. So if you want something reliable, don't base it on something that fluctuates. And so having a rule like that, having a habit stack, makes it easier and more reliable for you to get into it. Now, one caveat or one important distinction here is that you want habits to be so small that even when you don't have motivation, even when you don't really feel like doing it, you can still follow through on it. So I think a good question to ask is this habit small enough or easy enough that I can do it 98% of the time, no matter what the conditions, without fail? And if it's too big, if it's bigger than that, if you answer no to that question, then it's probably too big. And a simple kind of heuristic or rule that I like to use for this is what I call the 2-minute rule. And so you basically take whatever habit you're trying to build and you scale it down to something that takes 2 minutes or less to do. You focus kind of on the first action. So like read 40 books a year becomes read 1 page, or do yoga 5 days a week becomes take out my yoga mat. And sometimes people kind of resist that. Like I say this strategy and they're like, well, I know the real goal isn't just to take my yoga mat out, right? I know I like actually want to do the workout. So if it's this mental trick, then like, why would I fall for it? But I think something that you overlook, or people often overlook, is that a habit is like, here's another example. So I have a reader who ended up losing over 100 pounds. And one of the first things that he did was he went to the gym, but he wasn't allowed to stay for longer than 5 minutes. So he got in the car, drove to the gym, got out, did half an exercise, got back in the car, drove home. And it sounds silly. It sounds like ridiculous to people because, like, clearly this is not going to be the thing that gets this guy in shape. But what you realize is that he was becoming the type of person that went to the gym 4 days a week.
Yep.
And he was mastering the art of showing up. And I think this is kind of that fundamental truth about habits that often gets overlooked, which is a habit must be established before it can be improved, right? You need to make it like the standard in your life, make it the new normal before you worry about optimizing it or expanding. And so I think if you pair that philosophy with habit stacking, then you've got like a really solid base for sticking to a habit, even if you don't feel like it, because you're kind of focused on that first action, focused on that 2-minute movement. And you have a very specific plan for when and where that's going to occur. So if you've got those two things, then you have your habit small enough that you can stick to it almost all the time. And you've got a very specific plan for when and where that's going to occur. And that, for many people, is enough for them to stick to the habit. They don't need other strategies. There are a lot more that you can use, but just that specificity and scaling it down can be really helpful.
Right, because I feel like the idea is anything other than 2 minutes, or the idea of breaking these huge processes down into something small is kind of the principle of, like, how do you eat a whale? And it's one bite at a time. And it's, hey, yeah, you can't do downward dog yet, but you can get out your yoga mat and you can get out the app. You can start the yoga app if you'd like. And for those who are kind of like, well, I know it's not the real thing. The reality is, and I know this for me because I had to form a gym habit as well by just going, by just showing up, by just being there. And it was, you're not good at going to the gym yet, or you're not good at doing a whole 1 hour yoga routine, obviously, because that's not what you've been doing. But what you are good at? You're good at taking out that yoga mat. You can do that. You're an expert at that, and it's, I think people, it's sad. It's not kind of the fun way to look at it, but it's like, no, you can do this. You can definitely do this. And like, you can do the next thing. But we have these expectations of like grandeur or like already being amazing at something when we start. And it's like, hey, like, yeah, that friend we have, they've been doing yoga for 7 years. They went to India to become a yogi. It's like we're separated from the idea of enjoying that process. I think, like, especially Americans, I feel like we love results. Like, why wouldn't we love results?
I remember there's this guy named Dan John who's a strength and conditioning coach, and he has this like phrase or concept where he said, "You're not good enough to be disappointed." And I always thought that was a funny way to put it, especially for anybody who's in the beginning of a stage or beginning of building a new habit or practicing a new skill. But so often we get like disappointed with ourselves for not being the person who goes to the gym for an hour, or not being the person who's consistently this meditative yogi or whatever. And it kind of to the point that you just made, like, you haven't been practicing that. And so his thing is like, you're not allowed to be disappointed yet. You're not good enough. You haven't done, if you had been training for 7 years and then you weren't doing a good job, yeah, then you can be disappointed in yourself because you're capable of more and you're not performing up to your potential. But if you're new, then disappointment is not something you should be allowed to feel yet. Instead, you should just be practicing and refining and like finding small ways to get started. And then once you build up a body of experience, then you can start to scale and improve. But disappointment shouldn't really be part of the equation in the beginning.
Right. No, I love that. It's one of those things. If somebody was starting their mailing list today and then they had to compare it to James Clear's numbers or somebody else's numbers, they'd be like, well, I'm not as good as them. Well, yeah, you haven't been practicing. So no, I love that. One of the last things in the book that I really loved and I thought it was interesting was the idea of, the whole book is about habits. And so you look at it and you're like, all right, well, let's form some habits. But there's one section, and I don't know if it just hit with me a certain way, it was knowing when and when not to track a habit. And so we've been talking about a lot to, start or track a habit. What is the time to not do that?
Well, so I bring up habit tracking near the end of the book because it's like an effective way to stay on course with your habits, but also like add a little bit of satisfaction to them in the moment. Like if you, like for example, my dad, he has this habit of going for a swim. And so every day that he swims, he has this little calendar that he pulls out and he puts a little X on that day. And that's his habit tracker. And, seeing the X's stack up over the month is motivating him. But the point that I make in that section is that tracking also comes with some downsides. So one of the downsides is that sometimes it becomes more about the measurement than about the process. So it's called Goodhart's Law, but basically it says when a measure becomes the target, it ceases to be a good measure. And his point is, like, let's take a very common one, stepping onto the scale. So you measure your weight because you're hoping that measurement gives you some indication of whether you're getting healthier. And if the scale is getting lower, then you're losing weight and maybe you're, improving your health and so on. But for many people, the scale ceases to be a measure that just gives them a little insight into whether they're making progress. And it becomes the target. It becomes all about the number on the scale. And when that is true, it is no longer a good measure, because it was never the point was never for the number on the scale to move. The point was to give you an indication of whether you were making progress. And now that has been inverted. So one of the downsides of measurement and one of the downsides of tracking your habits is that if you choose the wrong measurement, then either one, it can consume your attention, like in the case of the scale. And then the other challenge is that you want to choose a measurement that comes at the right pace of feedback. So habits tend to stick when they deliver feedback at the right frequency, because one of the most motivating feelings in all of life is the feeling of making progress. If you feel like you're making progress, then you have every reason in the world to continue, because it's like, hey, this is going well, I should keep at it. And so for this reason, what you choose as a measurement is really important, because you want to choose a measurement that's giving you progress consistently enough, giving you signals that you're moving forward consistently enough that you have a reason to repeat it. Well, you can imagine, like, let's just take working out as continue this example. If your measurement is the scale, then the weight on the scale might not change very quickly. It might be weeks before it really moves much. And so in that case, the progress is very slow. You need to be working out 4 days a week, but the scale has stayed the same for the last 10 days. So that feedback might be too slow. Then you have another form, like maybe you wear like a heart rate monitor or measure your blood glucose levels, where, well, those measurements can change very fast. I mean, your heart rate can change just in, a moment or two. So if you're measuring it just based on that, well, sometimes the feedback can be too fast. But if you choose a form of measurement that comes at the same pace as the habit itself, like, for example, my dad tracking his swimming workout on that calendar, well, now every time he puts a workout in, he gets a little bit of feedback that, hey, you put another X on this day and you're making some movement toward what you're hoping to do. And so what that ideal pace of feedback is differs for each habit. And the best way to track things differs for each person, the goal that you're trying to move toward, but the person you're trying to become. But that idea that measurement it's not like a universal good. It can have downsides, and there can be some negatives to tracking your habits as well. Those are, I feel like, a couple of the caveats that were important to mention in that section.
No, that makes sense. Do you track any habits currently, or do you just kind of know mentally what you're trying to work forward?
Yeah, so I have a variety of things that are being tracked in different ways, but I just came out with this habit journal as like a supplement to Atomic Habits, and so it's a dot grid journal, a dot grid notebook that you can use like most dot grid notebooks. But at the back, there are 12 habit tracker templates in there, and so I've been using that for the last 3 months now to kind of track what habits I've been performing, and it's been interesting to have like a physical tracker in it, because most of the other things that I'm tracking are in spreadsheets and things like that. And there are definitely pros and cons to each. Like, I really like spreadsheets. I like being able to see the numbers add up. I like how clean they are and how they can be edited and so on. But there's definitely an advantage to having a physical tracker for some things. Like in one case, just the act of seeing the notebook every day, that is the thing that is reminding me to do this. I do like a nightly journaling habit. And I've never been a journaler until recently. Like, just creating this habit journal is kind of the thing that sparked it for me. And so when I see the journal, when I get into bed, it's sitting right there on the nightstand next to the bed. That physical cue is one of the things that reminds me to write the journal down and then like mark it down in the habit tracker. And you wouldn't get that with a spreadsheet because there is no physical cue. It's just like hidden in a folder somewhere in your computer. So anyway, so there are some pros and cons, and different ones that benefit you for different habits. But I've been using the habit journal recently.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Last question that's kind of, habit based, and then we'll get you out of here is, what about the, I can only have like food as a good example, but let's say it's a reactionary thing, right? You see the, name a fast food restaurant sign, and I've seen this research through your site too. You start to salivate or whatever, and then you're like, oh, I'm hungry, I'm going to go get this. How can somebody form a habit to go against those types of urges? Is it just, hey, no, I've planned my meal every day at 5 p.m. Or is it something smaller? Like, what does that look like when we're reacting to kind of bad habits that we've already formed?
Yeah, it's a good question. It can be a challenging one. So I think, let me give you two short-term strategies and then one like long-term strategy. So the best short-term approaches to breaking a bad habit, in my opinion, first one is reduce exposure. So in the case of the fast food restaurant, I had this actually. So I really like McDonald's French fries, and I don't usually order like anything else on there, but I would like love to just stop in and get a fry. And so the last place that I was living, when I would get off the highway to drive home, there was always a McDonald's right there. And so I would pass it all the time. And I got into this streak where I went there I probably went like 4 days or something, 4 out of like 5 days or whatever. And eventually I was getting off the highway one day and I was like, am I going to do this every time I get off this highway? Like, am I going to just go in there and get a fry every single time? And so I started turning left instead of right, so I wouldn't pass the McDonald's. And it took like an extra 3 minutes to get home because I basically kind of went around the block essentially. But I reduced exposure to that queue. And so taking a different route to work, slightly altering your commute, removing the cues, like digital cues that prompt you. So whether that's things like removing the, social media icons from your phone or things like that. Reducing exposure is a good one. That's a good way to curb the desire for a bad habit. The second short-term strategy is increase friction. So BJ Fogg, that Stanford professor I mentioned earlier, I think he has a good example of this where he liked popcorn. He enjoyed eating popcorn. It's not that he didn't want to eat it, but he didn't want to eat as much of it. And so he took it out of his pantry, walked down the hallway, went into the garage, climbed up on a ladder, and put it on the highest shelf in the garage. And, if he really wants to eat it, he can just go out there and get it. It's only like 30 seconds away. But if he's designing for his like default decision, right, if his like lazy action, or what is he going to do when he's tired or exhausted, he's not going to go out there and get it. And so the reason is because there's more friction associated with that task. So basically, increasing the friction of your bad habits just comes down to you want to put more steps between you and the bad behaviors and fewer steps between you and the good ones. So I think that those two strategies are good short-term solutions for breaking bad habits. Now, in the long run, the real answer to this, but it's challenging and I think it takes time, is you want to reassign what that the cue of your bad habit means. So say, for example, that you're like me and you enjoy McDonald's French fries. And right now, if you see a McDonald's, then what it means is, oh, that's tasty and enjoyable. And like, I would like to go in there. But let's say that you like read a book on the fast food industry and like how it distributes its food and processes its food and so on. And basically like reading whatever this book is, this hypothetical book, it ruins your view of McDonald's French fries. And you think that they're like terrible for you now. Well, now when you see McDonald's, suddenly it like means something different than it did before. So the cue is the same, but your interpretation of it has changed. And ultimately, if you want to break a bad habit, that's really one of the most powerful places to get to, is that if you can make it mean something new. Because if it no longer means something valuable, if you no longer anticipate or predict that it will benefit you, then you have no reason to follow through on it. And this, I think, is a big topic. I talk about it a little bit in Atomic Habits. I have a chapter on how to like reprogram your brain so that things that seemed hard don't seem as hard. But I think that there's much more to be said on it. I'll probably be writing more about this in the future because I feel like it can be very powerful if done well, but I haven't seen that much written about how to actually do that because it's kind of challenging. So But ultimately, I think that's the most powerful place to be, is that it just doesn't tempt you. It's like the difference between two people who see a pack of cigarettes, and one of them is a smoker and they interpret that cue as, oh, I feel like I need to smoke a cigarette. And the other person's never smoked a day in their life, and they see the pack and same visual cue, but it doesn't mean anything beneficial to them. And so it's really kind of the key to unlocking a lot of your bad habits is to figure out how you're interpreting those cues and how you can change that interpretation.
I love that. Awesome, man. Well, I want to ask you two fun questions before we get you out of here. One, obviously, we talked about you being an avid photographer. I've seen your work. I think it's awesome. Obviously, what are you shooting on right now, and what are you hoping to shoot next time you whip out the camera?
Yeah, so I have a Canon 6D and a couple of nice lenses for it that I enjoy using. I've gotten into aerial photography more, so I have the Mavic Air and use that occasionally. But what I've realized is that the last two photography trips I've done, I did more like location scouting and stuff beforehand, and that really paid dividends and helped a lot. I just came away with better stuff because of it.
Yeah.
And so what I'm starting to get to now is, our cameras are so good on our phones. And so I basically am probably just going to use my phone for most of my walking around photos now. But then when I actually want to get something that's print worthy, then I think what I'm going to do is I may upgrade to an even nicer camera, do more location scouting, and like have a very specific number of like print worthy shots that I'm trying to get. Maybe it's only like 3 or 5 over the course of like a week. And if I get 3 great shots on the really high quality camera, then I can do that. And then the rest of the time, like I used to do a lot of street photography and stuff, but it's kind of a lot to carry it around all day. And if I look back on the work, like I don't really know that I came away with anything amazing. So I think I'm going to start being basically applying a little bit more of like a minimalist approach to it and saying, okay, let's act like I can only get 3 good photos from this week. How can I make sure that the 3 best, and like put more research in up front?
Right. No, exactly. That was, for me, I went to Iceland 3 times before I photographed the Northern Lights, but it was one of those things like, where do I want to shoot it? What do I want the foreground to be? And I was very intentional. And you know what? I have a few photos, but the one photo that I have of the Aurora Borealis, behind, there's a mountain in Iceland called Kirkjufell, and I'm like, this is the one. Like, this is what I made. And it's one of those things too, where again, like we have access. That's what the internet's changed and iPhones have changed, but it's the intentionality and things like you talked about, just planning. And you can always use your phone to be like, okay, like there are tons of apps where you can plan the sun, you can plan the sky. You can say, okay, like we went out stargazing the other night and we're like, okay, the moon's going to be at here. Like this is where we can adjust. So I love that. That's really cool. I appreciate you sharing. And we'll have a link to some of your photo work in the show notes, just because I think that's cool. A lot of our audience is photographers, obviously. Last question is, what's next for you? You're teaching, podcasting, you're obviously promoting the book. You mentioned that you might want to write something else, some other supplemental content, or even another book. What's next for James? What's going on in Ohio and right now Singapore for you?
Well, I'm sure I will write another book at some point, but right now I'm really focused on building the best quality content around how to change our habits. And so part of that is thinking about Atomic Habits, like should it be upgraded and expanded in some way? What are the best like critiques of it right now? Thankfully, the vast majority of reviews are very positive, which of course is what I was hoping for. But I also am viewing it as like, okay, this is my first attempt at describing like how human behavior works and how we can change it. So let's like take all the feedback we can get and see if we can make it even better. So that's definitely top of mind. I mentioned the habit journal already. So we're kind of building out like, I only want to build products if they're useful. So I'm not just looking to like build things because I can. But I'm trying to question, what do people need to actually build the habits that they want? And the journal helps fill that in a little bit. The habit tracking templates help fill that in a little bit. Obviously, I'm doing some speaking on the book at various companies and corporations. And then we also have the Habits Academy, which is like our online course. And so we're completely revamping that and shooting a new version of it soon, which probably will be available by the time this interview airs. But anyway, so all of that is kind of like as a collection, like my suite of products or thinking on how habits work. And so if we can really get that dialed in, then I think I'll feel really good about what we're offering and what we have to provide and the value that we can create. And then eventually, I'd like to get back to writing my weekly articles as well. So definitely some writing, but a lot of habits thinking and work in the near future.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much, James, for coming on. We'll encourage everybody to go check out jamesclear.com and Atomic Habits. Thanks so much, man.
Awesome. Thank you.
Some of you guys are listening to the episode and you're like, what in the world did I just listen to? This is a photography, small business podcast. But obviously, knowing James for a while now, the idea of implementing these habits are going to have macro results in your business. You know, like one of the things that Caitlin James, another photographer, always says is like micro changes, macro results. James even says tiny changes, remarkable results. It's one of those things that if you can implement certain things in your business, in your life, even for me, you know, I've been on a health journey. It's going to benefit you in other ways that you can't even imagine. You know, obviously, fitness is an easy one, but just having more energy during the day, which comes from having fitness or eating the proper things and, you know, getting away from bad habits, it's going to positively impact the other things and goals that you have in your life. So thank you guys so much for listening to this episode. Give James Clear a shout out. Go say hi on Instagram. Tell him his photos are awesome. They're really, really cool. And I would encourage you to check out the book, Atomic Habits. It's so much fun and so insightful. I love diving into very, very, very niche things that can help us. And you know, you read that book, it's going to help you for the rest of your life. At least that's what I feel like it's done for me. And I hope it does the same for you. So guys, have a wonderful week. Thanks for being awesome.